always just wanted to say I'd like to thank the Academy. That was last weekend, sorry. But I also need to thank Rich for this amazing opportunity. I am truly humbled in the presence of Eustacia Cutler. What I've learned so far parenting a child with autism is that you can't do it alone. We all travel a labyrinth of life with the same goal in mind, and all take many different paths to get there. When raising a child like this, it's a big challenge, and we all fall in those little holes, like the ball falls in the holes on the labyrinth. And it's really hard to find someone to pull us back up, whether it's family or friends or other professionals. It is very difficult for those around us also to know what to say. So we really have to desperately seek and find those that have been there before us. And we seek out friends and family, which is very important. Eustacia Cutler not only gets it, but she's broken down the barriers and paved the way for the rest of us. Oh, I'm gonna get emotional. Even though her baby Temple is now in her mid-60s, she still continues to fight for our children and find ways for our families. Whether you all realize it or not, she is working very hard behind the scenes. I am so grateful for her continued effort for all children and extremely honored to introduce her to you today. If you're like me, you want to get a pencil and write down everything that you hear her say today. So please give a warm welcome for a very smart, tireless, and inspiring Eustacia Cutler.
Oh, thank you so much. There goes the water. Well, there goes the water. I'm here today I'd like to impart a little bit of insight, a little wisdom from what I see over the years. Because, in a sense, I'm your future. I'm where you will be many years from now. But what will be has turned into what was. And you will have come to terms with it. Not quite the way you thought you would, but you will be changed. Now, I know that's not what you really want to hear. What you want is an answer. All I can tell you is there are no answers. There are only choices. And choices can be changed. And you will change them, and you will be changed by them. So, with that thought in mind, I'd like to start by introducing myself. I am who I think I am, but I'm also who you think I am. And you are who you think you are. You're also who I think you are. There's a story beginning between us, and it feels conscious and social, but actually, most of it is neurological. Now, that's fine for us. Our neurology gives it to us without any trouble at all. But it doesn't give it to our children. And that's where the trouble starts. Our children essentially are literal. They see the world in terms of chairs, tables, the color of your sweater. What we're talking about now has no physical reality. It's just a bunch of ideas that are flowing back and forth between us. And it's fluid. It's random. Our children can't bear random. I might add, neither can a computer. As soon as you put it into a computer, it's become a program. Well, this is what our children try to do with every moment. They have wonderful logic and memory, probably better than we do. And what they're trying to do is to memorize each moment that's happened. But the trouble is, there's another moment coming, and another, and another, and another, and it doesn't stop. It's not surprising that our children get rigid, that they have, that they cannot handle it. And we're still They have no sense that we have a mind that's different from theirs. They know their own mind, and they can tell you about it, but they have no sense that we each have separate minds, that there's you and there's me, and we don't think alike. Now, the problem here begins to come back on us, because we are social creatures. So, if our child doesn't know who we are, who are we? A baby needs a mother to know she's a baby. But a baby needs a mother to know she's a baby. It works both ways. And I see mothers coming apart, and I see more and more now dads coming apart. They are no longer in the structure they thought they were in, because there is this double stress going on. Not only is it difficult to take care of their child physically, but there's this psychic stress going on, and they feel they're no good as parents, and maybe they're no good as people. They've lost a sense of their own identity. And all I can think of is the poem of John Donne, who said, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." We are social creatures, incomplete without each other. Before I came today, I decided to tell you about temples, bringing temple up because I know that's what you want to hear. But I wanted to tell it by honoring all the people who helped temple and who helped me. I couldn't have done it without them. As I said to Jen and Chris last night, temple didn't spring like Athena from the head of Zeus, fully armed and all wise. It was a long, complicated journey, but always with help, shared concern and shared expertise. Now, the first expert was Dr. Bronson Crothers, so he heads the list of those to honor. Temple didn't speak. Temple was born in 1947, and this is when she was 1949. She didn't speak. She didn't grab for my necklace and try to stuff it in her mouth. She didn't want to be touched. She didn't want to engage in any way at all. And she was mute. I took her to Bronson Crothers at Children's Hospital in Boston. We lived outside of Boston in those years, in Dedham, Massachusetts. Now, at that time, there was a famous doctor called Dr. Bruno Bettelheim. Do any of you know who he was? Good idea, because medicine is prone to fashion, and he was the fashion man, and he was a piece of work. He was from Vienna, he had one of those low, husky voices that was frighteningly authentic. The other thing that had happened at that time was television. Any of you know what it was like when we didn't have television, and suddenly it was there. And who was there on our set? We watched him. Our set had rabbit ears in those days. There was Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, who said, "It is infant schizophrenia. These children have been driven mad by their cold mothers." Try that one emphasized. Well, here's where culture comes in. Dr. Bronson Crothers was an old New England Yankee. New Englanders are Puritans. We do not lie down on couches and tell people our troubles. We stand up and we face them. He did not say anything to me about Dr. Bettelheim. Instead, because too, New Englanders are big on education. He said, I think she's going to learn to talk. Oh, first I have to tell you about the EEGs. Yes, I forgot that. He ordered 3 EEGs for Temple. Now, at this time, Temple's father felt she was retarded and wanted her to be institutionalized, and I wouldn't allow that. Now, I think Dr. Carruthers' first 2 EEGs were to put that to rest. They were for retardation or brain damage. There was neither. But his 3rd EEG always has interested me. It was for epilepsy. He said, now Temple has these very still moments with her head drooping, and they could be little petty-mouth seizures. Let us test her for epilepsy. There was none. But what's always interested me is that the neurological connection between autism and epilepsy, which was stumbled on during tests for epilepsy, was what transformed autism from psychosocial, which was the Freudian point of view, to bioneurological. But that didn't happen for another 15 years. So Dr. Bronson Carruthers was 15 years ahead of the rest of the medical establishment. And yes, he was for education, because New England has probably got more schools per acre than any other part of the country. He said, I think she's going to learn to talk, but let's speed up the process. And he recommended Mrs. Reynolds. She's my second one to honor. Mrs. Reynolds lived in Belmont, Massachusetts, and she ran a little school for children who were having trouble learning to talk. She took Temple on. Let me just get a look at my notes here. Here it is. That's what I want to see. Temple went to Mrs. Reynolds for 3 years, and she went 3 times a week, 3 hours a session. And here's this little girl who doesn't want to be touched. Mrs. Reynolds took hold of her jaw, told her where to put her tongue, showed her the difference between a B and a P, between a T and a D. And Temple let her touch her. I think the reason was that she wanted to talk. And as you all know, she hasn't stopped talking ever since. Now, Mrs. Reynolds also ran a little nursery school. There were other children there, and I didn't let Temple's father see it because they had Down syndrome children there. And I was afraid that he would say, you see, that's proof she's retarded. So I didn't let him see this school. I hid it. I hid a great many things in those years. What it did for Temple was, because it was a little nursery school, it was her first encounter with having to get along with other people. She had to sit in her chair and wait her turn. And she had to learn that at 2, between 2 and 5, which is when she was there. She learned this, that there are other people, and they have other interests than her own. That's an important step, and one not to be forgotten. And it's why I honor Mrs. Reynolds. The next person I'm honoring is Mrs. Huckle. Now I might say, all these women, you see, this is before women's lib. You also don't realize that at that time, there were only 3 occupations open to women: nursing, teaching, and stenography. Probably these women I'm talking about would now be principals of schools or doctors. This next one, honor, goes to Mrs. Huckle, who was British and eccentric. She was short and stout, and she had black gray hair. It was salt and pepper hair, and a vast black velvet tam she wore on top of it, and flowing black velvet pajamas. And she had run a school on the Riviera for the sons of Maharajas, and she was not intimidated by Temple's father. And she said, and he was quite she said, Temple, you may come to my school, but at the end of the summer, when you are 5, when you turn 5, you must have learned 2 things. You must learn to say the Lord's Prayer, and you must learn always to do your very, very best. Now, in essence, Mrs. Huckle gave her 2 assignments. One was an immediate one, a speaking one. You had to recite the Lord's Prayer. Well, that's not easy for a little girl who's just learned to talk. What I've always liked about that is it's also a good life lesson. The prayer asks for bread today. Give us today our daily bread. Not tomorrow's bread, not solving next week, just today we'll worry about. And also, let us forgive and forgive us for what we've done wrong, just so long as we forgive those we think have wronged us. 2 very good rules for life. Now, her second life lesson was, you must always do your best. And Temple always has. Now, at that time, I had to get a nanny because I couldn't manage at home. And I hadn't told Temple's father about Mrs. Reynolds' school. As long as I kept the house running smoothly, he didn't get back onto the idea of putting Temple into an institution. But it wasn't always easy. I hired a nanny who'd had experience, as she put it, with a little boy like Temple. We didn't even use the word autistic. We didn't really know it. Now, I'm not going to honor this woman because she was very difficult. And she took over. And took over more than I wanted to give over as a mother. But I was a very young mother. And you have to remember, too, that this is right after World War II. And there were no babies born during World War II. The men were all off fighting. So I'd never held a baby before I held Temple. And that put me at a disadvantage, along with being timid and feeling that maybe I wasn't that good a parent anyway. But the therapist I would like to honor is a woman named Barbara Hanft from New Jersey. When I talked to her about this, she said, as a therapist, she'd run into this trouble herself. She had tried to teach a young mother how to handle her child. And in the process, she handled the child far better than the mother could. Well, she thought the mother would be pleased. The mother wasn't pleased at all. She burst into tears. And Barbara said, I realized then that I would have to be the coach. It's longer and slower, and the temptation is when you can do it yourself much faster, not to want to take the time it takes to teach somebody else how to do it. Yes, she said it takes time, but it's deeper, and it's more meaningful, and it brings that mother to a better sense of herself. Next person I wanted to honor is Dr. Henry Putnam. He was our doctor in Dedham. He watched over Temple so carefully all these years, over all 4 of my children. And when one of my children was sick, he always came to the house. He said, I like to see the house where the child I'm trying to help, I want to see how that child's family lives. Do any doctors you know make house calls these days? Medicine has lost something. And I don't know if we can ever get the doctors back to thinking about medicine as a calling rather than a business. got through her summer with Mrs. Huckle. She was just turning 5. And Mrs. Huckle said, I think if you've got a little country day school near where you live, and they understood Temple's story, Temple could go into kindergarten there. So I would like to honor Mr. Everett Ladd, who was principal of that little school, which only went up to the 6th grade. And he said, when I told him the story, he said, yes, we'll take Temple, we're teachers, it's what we think we should be doing. But he also stated the terms quite clearly. It would be a partnership. He said, there are children that we are not taking because we do not feel we can work with the family. We feel we can work with you. Now he turned the Temple over, or me over at that point, to Mrs. Deach, who took care of the kindergarten classes through the 3rd grade. Again, these women were brilliant. Mrs. Deach, who deserves to be honored, said, we will talk to each other, tell each other what's happening, both at home and in school. And this meant that Temple found that whatever happened at school, somehow, mysteriously, her mother knew it. And when things were difficult at home, by gum, Mrs. Deach knew it. It held her to consistency, and it held her to expectation, that she was expected at this young age to carry out the day, and we would know what had happened during that day. It was a very good partnership, and I think I'd like to honor all teachers. You know, today, I don't know how many of you are teachers. You want to show me? Yeah, we've got teachers here. It's not a science. It's an art. It's an intuition, a sense of how to lead a child out. Think of the Latin derivation of the word education. It comes from educare, to lead out. That's what you're doing. Thank you. Now, Now, what took place here at this time was Mrs. Deach had said, if Temple has a bad day, can we send her home? I said, yes, of course. And there were bad days. And Mrs. Deach took time in those days to talk to the other children and tell them about Temple and what kind of trouble she had. They were wonderful. We underestimate children. We think that they don't understand. Yeah, they understand. And because they had a hand in helping Temple, now that they're all of them 65, and Temple is hugely successful, they feel that they had a hand in her success. And they did. Let us engage our children. They're not dumb. And they're willing to put forward. Some of this is just a question of spiritual generosity. Now, I know what I wanted to add in there, and that's siblings. See, in a sense, by talking to the children, she treated them like siblings. I wasn't that good. When people have asked me, what would you do over with what you know now? I do better by the siblings. I didn't know how to explain to them. And I can only say to all of you, if you have other children, try and find the time to be alone with those children so that they have their special moment. They're growing up too. And the other recommendation I'd like to make is that you may need a counselor. The great thing about a counselor is that children will tell a counselor what they won't tell their mother because they know it will upset their mother. They're very intuitive, children are. And I think that a counselor helps with that situation. Now the next one I'd like to honor is the other Viennese doctor who Temple went to for years, Dr. Henry Wermer. He was interning at Children's Hospital under Dr. Carruthers, and he was assigned to Temple. And I was trying to figure out how much time, somewhere between 12 and 16 years, till Temple was 18. She saw Dr. Wermer. And he always talked to Temple, and he talked then to me. It was a partnership where we all three learned, and we all three changed. I have to tell you this next one about him. The first time I saw him, he too was Austrian, but he had a very high, sharp voice. He sounded far more like one of those Nazi villains in World War II movies. And when we first met, you know, he stood up and he was shorter than I was, and it annoyed him. But he did not have a good start. And he said, then he said after that, you know, in Temple she has been psychotic, but now she's beginning to come out of it and become neurotic. I said, like us? He was not amused. And he called me an hysteric. Well, I didn't know what an hysteric was. Well, I learned that in Victorian terms, an hysteric is a forth-putting woman. Well, I knew that. My betters had told me I was too forth-putting. Right from the start. But in Freudian terms, it means a woman who wants a penis. I want to tell you, I've wanted a lot of things in life, but that's not one of them. Now, the years go on. We're covering quite a lot of years. And he said, I do not understand. He's beginning to change his mind. I do not understand why she got ill. And I do not understand why is she getting well. And then we come a few more years. And random being what it is, what two little girls got to be best friends in school. Temple's sibling and Dr. Wermer's oldest daughter. Now he saw these little girls playing together in the yard. And again he said, I do not understand, why is this not in the other children? If I was this monstrous cold beast, why wasn't it repeating? Well, I've always liked the fact that Temple said, well, I never told Dr. Wermer anything important. He wasn't looking for her childhood secrets. He was watching the changes in her behavior. And he himself was changing. Not quite so committed to his upbringing and education from Vienna, his Freudian view of life. He's living now in a new country, raising his children in this country. And who was he interning for? That old New England Yankee, Dr. Bronson Carruthers. I've always wondered, what did those two men say to each other? Change. That's what that's about. Now next I'd like to honor the neighbors in Dedham. They were wonderful. It was a very close neighborhood. And we have what we call the Leave It to Beaver Moms Union. We all agreed, saw life the same way, and basically the union said that any mother could lean out the window, yell down the road, "I'm going to tell your mother." And Temple knew what that meant. It was consistent all around the neighborhood, and it brought us all close together. I don't know if you're allowed to do that anymore, whether that's considered verbal assault, but it worked. And it seemed to me it was good. It was a warning to a child. You're stepping out of line. Now we come to the difficult years of adolescence. Here's what I wanted to go into. Temple had a happy childhood. They were all of them together. They rode their bicycles, they flew their kites, they played their games together. Now, old Mother Nature says, okay, throw it all away. I'm going to give you a new body. I'm going to give you new friends, new clothes, new thoughts, new weird sensations. It's all going to change. Oh, I remember when Temple said, I couldn't talk her out of her little girl shorts. I said, Temple, you can't wear them. You're nearly as tall as I am. And finally one day she caught sight of herself in the mirror and burst into tears. And she said, I don't want to grow up. Can't do anything about it. The clock's ticking. Now, not only was the clock ticking, but DCD, Dedham Country Day, the little country day school, the time was up there, and she had to go to another school. Now, here are all these children going through adolescence. And I don't know why the school, if you hear anger in my voice, it's genuine anger, why the school didn't know this about children at that age, that this is a hard time for all of them. Temple could not manage. She kept trying to go back to her childhood games. She took all the girls' clothes. It was the girls' school. Don't know if that was a good idea. Don't know that I would do it now. But she moved them around into different lockers. Well, it's sort of funny, but it's not funny to a little girl whose clothes are brand new and her role in life as a grown-up is brand new. They didn't like this. And she hid another girl in the broom closet and locked the door. Not funny. She thought they were funny pranks. No, they weren't. The other thing, which came up in the movie about Temple Grandin, was the deodorant. Believe me, her mother had tried for years to get Temple to use a deodorant, and she wouldn't. And I'm sure this contributed to the animosity that was building up. So Temple's coming down the corridor of the school, and one of the girls hisses at her, "Retard!" And Temple turned around and hit her with a book. The little girl went home, told her mother. The mother called the headmaster. The headmaster called our house. Temple answered the phone, because children always like to answer the phone. And he, instead of saying, "Hello, Temple, can I speak to your mother?" said, "You are a menace to society. Don't come back after Christmas vacation." And he hung up the phone. And Temple told me, she said he didn't even listen to my side of the story. Well, the thing that made it, fortunately, lucky, I was doing a study for WGBH in Boston on what were then called disturbed children. I've been to every school, and they were schools for teenagers, from Maine down through Rhode Island. I knew all these schools. And I knew which schools I thought were really good schools, were doing really good work for the children there. So I picked out 3 schools. I said, come on, Tim, we'll go see these schools, and you can pick out the school you would like to go to. I wanted her to have a hand in her own destiny. So we went to the 3 schools, and she picked out Hampshire Country School, the one you saw in the movie. Again, I think you should know that that was a high school for teenagers with autism, and that there were 3 in 1 to the staff. It had a farm and cows and horses, which Temple was crazy about at that time. And the head of the school was a wonderful man. Before getting to him, though, I have to tell you what happened at the Judge Baker Guidance Clinic, which Dr. Bronson Crothers had been head of and was now retired from. And the new group that had come in were very much, were very Freudian, in the Bettelheim pocket. It was not a good confrontation. They didn't like the choice I had made. And I think I wanted to, oh yes, I told them the story about Temple being accused of being a menace to society, and their feeling was, well, the school accepted her, seeing as how she was autistic. And they recommended that Temple come to their school. We'll be able to monitor her. I want to tell you, monitor is not a kind word. It applied control. And I had done all this study on these different schools, and I realized at that time that I knew more about teenage autism than they did, and that I had researched for this documentary. And I saw that the team was not giving a nod in the direction of Temple's happiness, no concern that she might be bewildered by their monitoring, fearful that once again she was being punished for whatever she had done that had turned her into a menace to society. I want to tell you, this team there was eerily detached and superior. It was a major turning point for both Temple and me. I've written before about that meeting, and I've tried to write it as a joke. Many times in those years, I hid behind laughter, and it's not a bad way to hide. It's a way to respond without appearing to take in the seriousness of what is happening, or even understanding what is happening. This meeting was not a joke. It was a direct confrontation. It was the moment when I took command. I picked up my coat and I left. To this day, I don't know what the medical record says. Probably that I was a refrigerator mother and the Judge Baker Guidance Clinic was no longer responsible for Temple. When I told this story to Dr. Werber, he looked so sad. And why do I tell you this? Because you're going to face similar moments and have to make a decision fast. And your decision is going to be based on what has gone before. And for me, it was all the insightful professionals who had guided Temple and guided me. I'd also like to put in a small honor for Dr. Donald McPherson, who was a psychiatrist who worked as a marriage counselor. I value his friendship over the years, his advice, his guidance and support. He was wonderful. I also would like to honor my old singing teacher, Wadsworth Pravandi. I went to him and I sang. He taught me all the French art songs, the German Lieder, the arias. And to this day, there are certain arias that he would sing, and I hear them even now in his old cracked baritone. It gave me a focus outside, that's what he gave me, outside of the problems that were happening in my family. Now I'd like to honor Henry Patey, who was the headmaster of Hampshire Country School, the school you saw in the film Temple Grandin. He was both insightful and generous with time. And every time I came to see Temple, when she had to go back to the dormitory, I would go and sit with him and his wife, and we would talk into the night. I value that very much. I think always of the fact that Temple did no work when she first came there to school, and I was worried. I was not pushing for college in those days. I saw that it wasn't in her pattern. It had been in her pattern to study very conscientiously. And Mr. Patey said to me, let it go. It doesn't matter if she loses a couple of years in there. What's important is that she gets her balance, she gets through her adolescence, and her body will quiet down, and then she'll go back to studying. And it happened exactly the way he said. Sure enough, after a couple of years, she came back to studying. And that's when she found her beloved Mr. Carlock, the science teacher there. He was a science teacher, and he was also trained in autism. And he too deserves to be honored. My next honor goes to, how am I doing here on time? Okay. Is Anne Brakeen. She was a librarian and school teacher who lived on a ranch in Tempe, Arizona. She was the sister of Ben Cutler, my second husband. Ben and I had visited the ranch and thought this would be a perfect place for Temple to expand her view of life. And we talked over the possibility of her staying with Anne for the summer. Then I talked it over with Temple, and I told her that she would have to work on the ranch. Now, what I didn't, at first Temple didn't take to the idea. She said, no, I want to spend the summer at Hampshire School, I want to ride the horses and take care of them. I said, I'll make a deal with you. Can you manage a week? Flying was easier in those days, a lot easier. I'll take you right to the gate, and Anne will be at the gate at the other side to pick you up. So, and if you want at the end of the week to come home, you can come home. Well, at the end of the week, she adored it. It worked. Now, we had also agreed that Anne must be paid a teacher's salary for guiding Temple, and that also Temple should be given a wage of $20 a week for working for Anne on the ranch. Again, I hid this. I hid things at a time that I didn't know what else to do, but it was a mistake. What I hadn't taken into account were Anne's own daughters, who couldn't understand why suddenly their mother was paying no attention to them and giving all of her attention to this girl who would come in that they didn't know from the outside. Fortunately, I've been able to explain that to Anne's children, and I hope the explanation helped. But it isn't always a good idea to hide things. Next, I'd like to thank the neighbors in Bronxville. Before we moved there, Temple didn't come there a whole lot, but before she was coming, I went to all the neighbors and explained about Temple, and I said, you'll have a knock on your door, and it will be, you'll open the door, and there will be Temple, and she'll say, I'm Temple Grandin. And I told them all about her. They were wonderful. They helped her, they greeted her, they took her into their house when she knocked on their door. Temple received her diploma from Hampshire Country School, and she went from there to Franklin Pierce College. Now, Dr. Frank DePietro, who was president of Franklin Pierce College, deserves to be honored. He and Mr. Patey were close neighbors there in New Hampshire. Rindge, New Hampshire is where it was. They decided between them, Temple couldn't take exams, she couldn't manage it nervously. They would take her pro tem on the agreement that she would go back and talk to Mr. Patey once a week, which she did. And Temple thrived. It worked. And she graduated with honors, second among 400 graduates. Now, of course, she wanted then to go to graduate school. The problem was she couldn't do math. And the dean at Franklin Pierce was worried, didn't know how to handle it. Now, I have evidence of the friendship between Dr. DePietro and Henry Paley, because Frank DePietro told me the story of that. But my hunch is that the dean at Franklin Pierce talked to the dean at Arizona State University. Temple was allowed to substitute a course, and it was the last time that Temple needed academic help. Now, I want to say that Temple is not cured of her autism, but she is fulfilled, and she's fulfilled as she would like to be fulfilled. That's the target. Arizona State University and the Dedham Country Day School now will make no accommodation for anybody on the autism spectrum of any variety. I think we have got to straighten out the view of the mainstream, help them. And as fast as I can, I'm going to give you a quickie course on what I think we have to get across to them. Because we cannot mainstream our children unless the mainstream understands what's going on. And it's not rocket science. I always like to tell this story about my youngest grandson. I have 5 grandsons who are in college, and 2 have finished with college. This is my youngest, Nicholas, who's a freshman in college. He was a baby who hadn't begun to talk, and he was sitting in his high chair. His first words were not Mama, Dada, but Oreo. He pointed to the cookie jar, and he looked at us, and he said, Oreo. That meant that his neurology had given him the idea of something. For our children, you can say, point to the shovel, and they can point to it. But if you say, point to the thing you dig with, they're lost. They don't have the idea of the shovel. Nicholas had that. He also had context. His neurology told him that his high chair was where he got things to eat. And he'd better speak up fast for that cookie before somebody took him out of his high chair if he wanted the cookie. Now that relates very strongly to relevance, which is part of what our children have trouble with, particularly our very bright children, who can do all kinds of figures. If they ask you when you were born, what's the date, they'll tell you what day of the week you were born on. Well, I don't really care. It has no relevance. The difference probably between Bill Gates and Jerry Newport, who's the man who always asks you when you were born, and probably is just as bright as Bill Gates. But Bill Gates knows relevance. Jerry Newport doesn't. Bill Gates is a zillionaire, and Jerry Newport drives a cab. Now the next thing that comes to here is eye contact. Eye contact. What did Nicholas do? He looked at us. Our children have trouble with eye contact, and they don't understand that it's shared information. You see, in essence, Nicholas connected the cookie jar to eye contact, looking at us, he already knew, his neurology was telling him that we had a different mind from his mind. And you get the idea of a cookie out of his mind into our mind. That's shared information. And with it, a phrase that always seems to baffle people is executive function. Essentially, all it means is Nicholas could put it all together. Now, we can see a lot of that in animal life. I love the story of the squirrel in our kitchen in Bronxville. It had been somebody else's pet squirrel. I was unloading groceries and dumping them on the kitchen floor and going back to the car and getting more groceries. I come back and the squirrel has opened up a box of cookies out of my, come in through the window, out of my package of groceries. We looked at each other. It seemed to me we looked at each other for an eternity. The squirrel knew that I was the alpha animal and these were my cookies. I, on the other hand, knew that if this squirrel turned tail and ran through my house where there were 2 cats and a dog, all of them good hunters, we'd have a particular brand of chaos. Then the squirrel did, I tell you, he did the squirrel equivalent of a slow walk at high noon. He took himself very slowly and carefully out of the box of groceries, the bag, up the window, and hopped out. Now, in essence, you see, it's there in animals. You know about eye contact. You all have dogs. They're big on eye contact. But essentially, that squirrel is also that shared information. In the wild, the rule is animals who stare at each other too long, it's a sign of belligerence. So my stare at the squirrel said, you better get out of here, you better back down. He didn't want to lose his dignity. And I wanted him, when I saw what he was going to do, I thought, that's okay, I can go with that. It's there in a rudimentary form in animal life. And what we're trying to do is keep our children from self-absorption. If we understand these glitches, we can include them better because they have a tendency to withdraw into a computer. Because a lot of times, first place, it gives them a feeling they're working alongside of somebody. They feel somehow that's companionship. But the mind of the computer works very much the way theirs does. A computer doesn't have shared information. It doesn't have eye contact. It cannot work with context. It has no value system. And it cannot work with the idea of something. It cannot work with random. Let us not let our children be trapped in that limbo. Come on, let's invite them into the world with us. Now I've got just time enough to read you the last passage, and I'm going to read this because it's a bit close to the bone, of what happened between Temple's father and me when one day Dr. Verma, the Viennese psychiatrist, asked me to come into his office. I didn't know why. Temple was off at school. But when I got there, he said, are you aware that Mr. Grandin is trying to prove that you are insane? That he is keeping a notebook on you and he plans to take you to court. I think you better leave your marriage, and I think you better leave as quickly as possible. I do not like to do it, but I will do it for you. I will testify to your sanity. On hearing this, Temple's father backed down, and I was free to leave my marriage, taking my children with me. Recently, a doctor told me you were lucky. Given Bettelheim's authority in those years, if you hadn't had that doctor, your husband could have had you legally declared an unstable mother, and the court would have awarded him with all 4 of your children. 15 years later, the truth about Bettelheim emerged. He didn't have a medical and psychiatric degree that he laid claim to. We'd all been taken for a ride. I have to put in here for the men because it's not a good picture for men. But you ought to know it. This came out of the New York Times. A woman is born with all the eggs she'll ever carry. By the time a man turns 40, on the other hand, his gonad cells will have divided 610 times to make spermatozoa. By the time he's in his 50s, that number goes up to 840. Each time those cells copy themselves, mistakes appear in the DNA chain. Some researchers now think that a percentage of these mistakes reflects not past random mutations, but experience-based epigenetic markings. Another theory holds that aging gonad cells are more error-prone. In any case, we now know that the children of older fathers show more signs of schizophrenia, autism, and bipolar disorder than the children of younger ones. Men, take autism, not only physically, but emotionally, much harder than women do. It strikes at the heart of their sense of honor. Women are not in the business of honor. We're built to incubate life and make it grow. Our bodies swell with birth and then return to their old shape. Our breasts fill with milk and then empty. We accept. We're flexible. Men's bodies are muscular and hard to the touch. They're built to hold fast to their honorable intent. But what exactly is that intent? Author James Salter writes of the Army Air Corps flight missions in the Korean War, that war between World War II and Vietnam. A time and place, Salter tells us, where free of the gravitational forces of reality, men feel the irresistible lure of the heroic. Among the posted Air Corps maps and charts, Salter gives the highest rating to the claims board. On it was listed the name of every pilot in the group. Small red stars marked them. Some belonged to dead men. I read Salter's words. I recalled a man's haunting tale of flying over the Pacific on a World War II bombing mission. How, as he talked, he cherished and relived each detail. The plane's ascent, the perfection of the dawn. Most of all, his own pristine joy. I wish I'd died then, he said. I remember my shock at his words. Had the man found no rewarding, meaningful moment in the years we'd all of us spent raising our children and living out our family lives? Perhaps the kind of honor that Salter describes is hard for a peacetime dad, particularly the dad of a child on the autism spectrum. Not just any boy, his boy. For that dad, there may be only the embarrassing intrusion of a kid who doesn't get it. At best, maybe the uncomforting recognition of his child's struggle to master what it is he thinks his father wants from him. Even if that father walks away, as many do, yelling that he wants his life back, in his heart he knows he will never be free to reach for Salter's glory. Each time he visits his son, shame will creep over him, and with it an additional shame that he should feel that way. Odd. Autism is a male disorder. In World War II, Temple's father survived the Battle of the Bulge in a tank against the Nazis, those enemies of Temple's Viennese doctor. He undertook reconnaissance, searching out the enemy and the chances of survival, acquitting himself with courage and holding fast to his sense of honor. After the war, all he wanted was to return to the life he had always known. And what a beautiful life it was, stretching back over the generations, and parties on porches with flowery women and men in red linen trousers, tennis in the day, and dance music on Saturday night. That's what Temple's father dreamed of in the heat of battle. He didn't think of his life as privileged. He thought of it as home. And our home had gone horrifyingly awry. Autism was an appalling enemy. If I couldn't see that, then I too must be the enemy. His obsession grew monstrous. He went to battle to destroy us for our own good. And in the end, it led him to dedicating his life to proving that God doesn't exist. Yet through it all, he never lost his faith in the stock market. At night, he would lull himself to sleep, adding up figures from the financial page, writing them down on the flyleaf of whatever book was handy. To this day, I still open books and find those deeply incised columns of calculation, reliable, enduring, whereas God, like the young dogwood, might not make it through the winter. Before he died, Temple's father left word that his body was to be given to a medical school, not so much for the edification of medics, but to prevent a family burial. His children did bury him. Burial services are for the living. They laid his ashes to rest in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's taken me all these years to understand that the tension, the temper, his inability to understand the source of what he so despised in his daughter, it was all his own. And who was there to help him through his childhood, long before anyone had coined the word autism? My rage is gone. Sorrow hits, and I ache to forgive him. Over and over, I dream that I forgive him and that he forgives me. In the end, I was the one who left, taking with me 4 children and happiness. Where was I in all this? Temple, my darling, when you were born, I was very young. The world I came from, the world I married into, didn't ask for much from me, but social grace. The messy business of talent and passion wasn't encouraged, and passion gone awry, it was hard to excuse. I had to risk rejection, and I was rejected. I had to search for myself, dig under the skin and touch the glossy viscera, looking for what constitutes being human. Autism was a way to learn, but not enough. Acting and writing took me deeper. Singing was my ticket to what I needed to see and touch and feel and be a part of. In the locked wards of the veterans' hospitals, I sang for the men who had lost their minds in the Korean War. Men who, under the stress of horror, had become catatonic, who stood all day, rigid and wordless. I sang to them if I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. And here and there, I could see a foot tap, ever so slightly, but tapping. They were there, somewhere, inside the horror. I sang in the ward for the men who'd lost their faces and were waiting for the reconstructive surgery they prayed would make them look human again. I studied autism and I studied retardation. I learned that nature can make cruel mistakes, and the mistakes, however alarming, will live and talk and want attention and need love. I had to learn that madness and error are in us all, and it's only by by a hair's breadth that we are who we are. Thank you.
Eustacia is going to take a couple questions in a minute. I wanted to mention that her book will be on sale at the desk out front. She's happy to autograph them for you, and she's going to be around all day because she loves to talk to parents and professionals in the field, and she encourages you to come speak to her individually. If you haven't, how many people have seen the movie, the HBO movie? If you haven't, it's I think the best movie ever done about disability. It really puts you in the mind of Temple and really great understanding. And it was the movie that inspired me to contact Eustacia because of the way she was portrayed, and I think very accurately, in the movie by a beautiful actress, not as beautiful as Eustacia. And I also want to say on behalf of the men in the audience that we're all trying to do better, right?
Sorry to scold them.
And we appreciate you being here. That says a lot. If you do have a question, just raise your hand and we'll take a few questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions if you have time, if you have one. Please.
I do. It's not so much about autism, but more about your life.
I can't hear it, so.
I can hear pretty well. I can repeat it for you.
Okay, repeat it.
Yeah.
I was wondering why your husband wanted to declare you insane. What was the basis for that?
Why your husband wanted to declare you insane? What was his basis?
Oh, I think he wanted me proved insane so that he could get control of the children. You see, because of the way Bettelheim was functioning, he picked up on that. It would have meant that he would have total custody of the children, and I would have had supervised visits. And 4 children would have said, "Mom, where are you?" He wanted to punish me too.
Yes, please.
What was the birth order of the children? Was Temple your first?
Temple's the oldest. She was my first, yes.
And then how off, spacing?
They go, I spent my 20s pregnant or nursing. But she's the oldest, and then comes her sister, and then comes her brother, and then comes another sister. And they're all very successful, and I'm very proud of them all.
Can you just tell for people who may not know what Temple is doing right now?
She teaches animal behavior at Colorado State University, and she also talks, of course, about autism everywhere. And she's very good at it. And I'm very proud of her. I just hope she isn't going to be exhausted. I do. She does admit to me sometimes now that, gosh, she's kind of tired.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about the rate of increase with the diagnostic of autism?
What are your thoughts about the rate of increase of the diagnosis of autism?
You know, that's such a good question. That's really important. Yes, I think that there's a lot of truth in that last statement I read, that we may be in our environment creating a situation. You see, there's pollution. It's not just the male gonads, but there's pollution in umbilical cords now. So we've created a more dangerous situation. I think, however, that other cultures in the past absorbed children better than we are today. And this is one of the things that I would like to work for. I know that on farms, they must have said, "Nah, he doesn't talk, he milks the cows." They just took it, and I think always of ships going to sea, we use the expression even today, to know the ropes. Those ropes are sea ropes. And those young men climbed a mast that was 3 stories high in a heavy wind I would rather have an obsessive Asperger up there than anybody else. He will know the ropes. We've lost some of that, and I think we have to readdress it. I might as well throw it in now while I've still got the mic. Temple and I have set up a Temple Grant and Eustacia Cutler Autism Fund, and we're dedicated to supporting and guiding all members of the family, because any kind of disability throws off the family. But as I've outlined for you, in terms of the children having no appearance of anything wrong with them, but they don't know us and they don't know, it also happens in the neighborhood. They too are thrown off when the child doesn't know how to respond to them. So we are trying to address that, and also all the organizations that are helping them. We need better networks between organizations. Everybody knows of each other, but they don't know each other. And nothing beats the conversation, like the conversation we had last night, where we're going to share information and share approach. We need that, and that will help families.
You mentioned in your talk about the importance of talking with neurotypical siblings and making sure as parents we spend time with them as well. Now, basically, well, is there any?
I'll tell you.
I'm trying to figure out how did you relate to your other children? All of the issues that you understood that Temple was facing every day.
I don't know that I did. I didn't know how to explain it, but we were somehow closer to each other. And it was and actually the little town of Dedham was a very little town, and we spawned the baby boomers. We all had big families. The rule was you can lend the baby carriage, but you cannot give it away because you'll get pregnant again. So there was an intuitive closeness. You see, I didn't have a chance to go into the division between systemizing and empathizing. There are two neurological traits. Systemizing is our way of understanding the inanimate world. Empathizing is our way of understanding the social world. Systemizing is important. I always think we count in tens because we have 10 fingers. Well, where did zero come from? Zero doesn't exist. Put it into a system, and you can build the pyramids. It's very old, zero. The Egyptians say they invented it. The Arabs say they invented it. But I'll bet whoever invented it had a lot of Asperger tendency. Now, with empathizing, do you all know what mirror neurons are? You do, good. And they were stumbled on inadvertently. Mirror neurons are essentially neurons that learn by imitation. And I think probably when you speak of the neighborhood, I'll bet this did it. We kind of sensed each other. When you look at young doctors interning in a hospital, I noticed they all copy. All doctors have this little pat, welcoming pat they give to your arm. And I'm sure they have learned it as young medical students going on rounds with an older doctor who takes them into a hospital room, and he's going to talk to them outside the room about the case. But while he's there, talking to the patient, he finishes talking, and then he gives the patient a little comforting pat. They all do it. They all learned it and don't even know that's how they learned it. And you see, that brings up apprenticeship. And do you know who Simon Baron-Cohen is? Okay. The other day when I was talking to him, I said I was interested in mirror neurons and their connection to apprenticeship. And he said, oh, I hadn't thought of them that way. And then he was still for a moment. And then he said, my grandfather was a watchmaker. You can't learn to make a watch except by imitating. Internship. So they're two very valuable traits. Men have more systemizing trait more than women do. Women have more empathy than men. Ideally, we have a little of both. Takes both.
We're gonna stop there. We have about a 5-minute break before the breakout sessions start. I encourage you again to visit the exhibitors. Please join me in thanking Eustacia Cutler one more time.